All right, 2.7, solving linear inequalities. Now, inequalities is pretty similar to equations. And the difference between an inequality and an equation is your inequality symbols. Now, I'm not so sure what I did up here. I'm thinking it should have been less than, greater than, less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. It's kind of silly that we have funny symbols up there. All right, so an inequality symbol is your less than, your greater than, your less than or equal to, your greater than or equal to. These will be in place of your equal sign. So an example would be like x plus 8 is greater than 2. Now, the rules, the additive property of equality, or addition property of equality, and multiplication property of equality still applies. There's only one new rule that you need to note, and we're only going to see this probably 1 or 2 times in the notes. You'll see it maybe a little bit more in your homework. But when you multiply or divide both sides of the inequality symbol by a negative number, your inequality symbol flips or changes directions. But don't worry about that right now. We are going to go over that when we get to that example. Now, I want to recall the number line and its parts, because when we solve linear inequalities, we have to do a little bit with the number line. And I'm just going to write down what we did for our number line, and this time I'm going to do a little bit more. On the left side, your numbers go decreasing all the way to negative infinity. On the right side, your numbers go decreasing all the way to positive infinity. These are symbols that we're going to see today when we write our interval notation. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to graph inequalities and then write them in interval notation. Interval notation is very important that you learn, because it is something that you will use in intermediate algebra and college algebra as well. And it's so confusing to a lot of students. Remember that I told you that on the ends of your number lines it looks like a greater than and a less than. This might help you determine whether your graph is going to negative infinity or positive infinity. Let's see. First, we want to graph x is less than 5. Now, if I'm looking at a graph, if I have, you really kind of just need to know where 5 is on the number line. So I'm just going to throw a graph out real quick. There's a couple of things we do when we graph. First off, we look to see if your inequality symbol is less than or greater than, or less than or equal to and greater than or equal to. Well, what's the difference? When you're graphing, if it's less than or greater than, we're going to use parentheses for that number. If it's less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, we're going to use a bracket for the number. Well, this is a less than with no line underneath it. So that means that I'm going to use a parentheses at my 5. And also, if you notice, again, this matches this direction. It also is pointing to the left. So your inequality symbol is going to point in the direction you want to shade. So I want to use a parentheses at 5, and I want to shade to the left. Now, why to the left? Because my inequality symbol is pointing to the left. So I have a parentheses at 5, and I shade all the way to the left. My interval notation is going to read exactly like my graph. It's going to go from negative infinity to 5. Now, my 5 has a parentheses. My negative infinity and my positive infinity will always have parentheses. No matter if this has a line underneath it or not, your negative and your positive infinities will always have parentheses. This parentheses or bracket depends on whether the inequality symbol has a line underneath it or not. Let's look at our next example. And I'm writing the word interval notation because this is the graph and this is the interval notation. And when you're dealing with inequalities, interval notation is like your answer. That's your solution. That's what you're going to type in Course Compass. So it's very important for you to understand interval notation. So let's graph x is greater than or equal to negative 1/2. Now don't worry that it has a fraction. It's not going to matter. So remember, your graph goes from negative infinity to the left to positive infinity to the right. And I'm just going to draw where negative 1/2 is. And remember, if you have 0, 1, and negative 1's on the other side, you're going to have a positive 1/2 in between 0 and 1, that means you're going to have a negative 1/2 in between 0 and negative 1. Now let's look to see if you have a bracket or a parentheses with your number. I have x is greater than or equal to negative 1/2. So the greater than or equal to means I'm going to have a bracket. Now which direction is it pointing? It's going to the right side because it matches your greater than, it matches your positive infinity side, whatever one you want to think of. So I'm going to have a bracket at negative 1/2, and I'm going to shade in the direction that inequality is pointing. And since it's pointing to the right, I'm shading to the right. So this is the graph of my interval notation, or in my inequality. Now let's put it in interval notation. And your interval notation, again, will match your graph perfectly. The first thing that's on my graph is a bracket. That's going to be the first thing on my interval notation. I have a bracket at negative 1/2. So that's what I'm going to write. And I graphed it all the way to positive infinity. So that's what I'm going to write. Now remember, positive and negative infinities always have parentheses, no matter what. The parentheses or the bracket with the numbers, determines on the inequality symbol that is in your problem. So this only goes with the number, but your parentheses will always go with a negative or a positive infinity. Okay? This is kind of a big deal to understand. We will have a ton more examples, but hopefully you can get into your interval notation and really understand why it works and how it works. And we'll pick up with solving inequalities in our next video.